Block 1. The will that wrote me out. They say the dead can't betray you. They're wrong. My name is Lauren Whitaker, 34, only child of William Whitaker, a respected philanthropist, decorated Navy veteran, and owner of one of the largest construction firms in Virginia. He died of a sudden stroke. No final goodbye, no warning, just gone. But that wasn't the part that broke me. It was what came after. The will reading was held at his attorney's office, a quiet, sterile room where grief hung heavy like fog. I expected the usual. The estate, the company shares, maybe a letter of parting wisdom. Instead, the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Your father left everything. The house, the assets, the company, the vehicles, the residual trusts, to Ms. Elizabeth Harlow." Elizabeth Harlow, his business associate. A woman 28 years younger than him. A woman I'd met once, 5 years ago, when she showed up to a gala in a red silk dress and called my father, darling. I laughed at the time, called her his charity arm candy. Now, she was legally me. I was stunned, then furious, then broken. No explanation. No letter. Not even a posthumous apology. Just a clean sweep. She stood outside the attorney's office like she owned the sidewalk, black sunglasses, smug smile. "It's what he wanted," she said to me. And in that moment I knew. She didn't just inherit his fortune. She inherited his secrets. And I would find out what those were, even if it meant tearing open every locked drawer in my family's legacy. Block 2. The woman who replaced me. Elizabeth Harlow didn't just take my inheritance. She rewrote my father's entire history. Within a week of the will being executed, she moved into the family estate, the Whitaker home that had belonged to my grandparents. The same home where I learned to ride a bike, cried through my first heartbreak, and held my mother's hand as cancer took her too soon. Now, Elizabeth posed in the foyer on Instagram, sipping wine beneath the Whitaker family crest. Captions like, "Built by his legacy, protected by his love." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask, "What did you do to him?" But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I dug. I pulled property records, corporate filings, and court documents. I searched for her name and everything. What I found wasn't illegal, but it was damning. She had power of attorney since 2021, 2 years before my father's death. Signed when he was recovering from a minor surgery. Funny, no one told me about that surgery. She also had been granted signatory rights for 2 of his subsidiary companies. Both used to funnel charitable donations into joint investments, meaning she controlled his money long before he died. But the most chilling discovery? She'd quietly changed the beneficiaries on his life insurance policy 6 months ago. Not just removing me, replacing me. I wasn't even listed as a contingent. She erased me like a typo, and the more I looked, the more it felt like a strategy, not a love story. So I went to the one person who knew my father's mind better than anyone. His old business partner, Gerald Kim. He hadn't spoken at the funeral, hadn't shown up to the will reading, but when I called and asked, "Do you think Elizabeth manipulated him?" he didn't hesitate. "No, I think she engineered him." And that's when the real story began. Because Elizabeth hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd staged a hostile takeover of our family, and I was about to turn that spotlight on her. Block 3. Secrets behind the portraits. Gerald Kim wasn't just my father's partner. He was his closest friend for over 3 decades. If anyone had reason to lie, it wasn't Gerald. He had already been bought out of the business 2 years ago, a move that confused everyone at the time. Strategic restructuring, my father said. Gerald now admitted the truth. She convinced him I was slowing the company down. He trusted her. More than he trusted me. More than you. He slid a manila folder across his dining table. Inside, board meeting minutes, unsigned contracts, and photos. of Elizabeth with lobbyists, developers, and most curiously, a man named Thomas Greer. Thomas was a known consultant for zoning commissions. He also had 3 sealed ethics complaints. Guess who paid them to disappear? My father. Elizabeth, it turned out, was more than a gold digger. She was a strategist. She had inserted herself into my father's orbit, just as his company began acquiring land for green developments, properties that suddenly gained approval at suspicious speed. Gerald suspected fraud. He tried to raise concerns. That NS when his shares were bought out, and he was quietly edged out of every decision. Elizabeth knew the law. She knew business. And she knew him. She fed his ego, played the long game, and positioned herself as the only one he could trust. By the time she rewrote the will, she wasn't manipulating him anymore. She owned him. But here's the part she didn't plan for. My father wasn't just a businessman. He was paranoid, and paranoid men leave backups. Gerald said there was a safe, hidden in my father's private study, behind a false panel in the wall, where a portrait of my mother still hung. That's where I'd find what Elizabeth didn't want anyone to see. And if it was what Gerald thought it was, I wouldn't just reclaim my inheritance. I'd bury her in the truth she thought she'd locked away. Block 4. The safe and the sins. The Whittaker estate didn't feel like home anymore, not with Elizabeth's scent on the furniture, not with security cameras aimed at my mother's rose garden. But I had a key. She hadn't changed the locks, not yet, and I knew that house better than she ever would. I waited until she left for one of her philanthropy brunches, drove in, slipped through the back. My father's study was untouched. Dark wood, leather chairs, that same brass lamp he'd refused to replace since the 90s, and the portrait of my mother, still centered above the fireplace. I pulled it down. Behind it, a metal panel with a keypad. I knew the code. Her birthday, not Elizabeth's, my mother's. Inside the safe was a stack of folders, legal, medical, financial, and a flash drive taped to the back wall. I grabbed everything, didn't even breathe until I was back in my car. What I found over the next 72 hours rewrote everything I thought I knew. Medical evaluations, showing early signs of cognitive decline, dated 2 years before his death, the same period Elizabeth was granted power of attorney. Audio files, private voice memos where my father expressed confusion, frustration, paranoia, including one labeled Elizabeth. She keeps pushing me to sign things I don't remember discussing. I think she's changing things when I'm not all there. A letter, handwritten, addressed to me. If you find this, I'm sorry. I didn't want to believe it. But if Gerald was right, and she used me, do what you must. You're my daughter. The rest is just paper. That line shattered me, because it was the first confirmation I wasn't crazy, that he had loved me, that somewhere beneath her manipulation, he still remembered who I was. And that letter, that was enough. Enough to challenge the will. Enough to raise legal doubt. Enough to burn her reputation to the ground. But I didn't just want revenge. I wanted justice. And Elizabeth Harlow was about to learn. She picked the wrong heir to erase. Block 5. The Mistress meets her match. I didn't go straight to court. I went to strategy, because women like Elizabeth don't break under legal pressure. They break under public scrutiny. Step 1. I hired an attorney. Not just any, but Renee Calder, known in DC as the Widowmaker. She specialized in estate fraud, undue influence, and elder financial abuse. When I showed her the documents, she didn't even blink. "This is going to get ugly," she said. I smiled. Good. Step 2. We launched a motion to contest the will, citing lack of mental capacity, manipulation, and undue influence. Attached were copies of the letter, the cognitive evaluations, and the voice memos. But we didn't stop there. Step 3. We leaked a sanitized version of the story to the press, not tabloids, business journals. We framed it as a story of a powerful developer's legacy being hijacked by his executive companion. We included the zoning fraud suspicions, the shell companies, and the sudden power shift. Elizabeth's name began trending, not as a philanthropist, as a parasite. She fired back with a countersuit, defamation, harassment, slander. But we had the truth, and that truth didn't need a press release. It had evidence. Emails, contracts, memos signed on his behalf. In court, she tried to claim I was grieving irrationally, that I had always resented her relationship with my father. But when we played the audio files, my father, confused, scared, whispering about being used, the courtroom changed. The judge ordered a freeze on the estate, opened an inquiry into the power of attorney, and scheduled a full evidentiary hearing. Outside, the media swarmed. I stood on the steps, holding my father's letter in my hand. "I'm not fighting for money," I said. "I am fighting for the version of my father who knew the difference between love and control." And that version? He left me something better than an inheritance. He left me the last word. Block 6. The legacy on trial. The courtroom wasn't just filled with lawyers. It was filled with witnesses to his life, former employees, family friends, even my father's old driver, a quiet man named Carlos who testified under oath that Elizabeth once asked him to drop off paperwork at the lawyer's office while my father was asleep. Paperwork that later appeared in his revised will. Renee presented timelines, financial discrepancies, contracts signed by my father during a period when neurologists had documented his cognitive disorientation. We exposed how Elizabeth had filtered his emails, isolated him from former advisors, and pushed Gerald out under the guise of efficiency. She hadn't just inherited his estate. She had eliminated every voice of dissent before he died. And then came the bombshell. Renee subpoenaed Thomas Greer. Under pressure and threat of perjury, he admitted to be consulting for Elizabeth on multiple property deals that had been disguised as charitable land use to gain expedited permits. They weren't just morally wrong, they were criminally deceptive. The court froze all Elizabeth's holdings tied to those properties, and her expression cracked for the first time. She wasn't smirking anymore. She was bleeding status. I didn't gloat. I sat quietly. Holding the pen my father used to sign the first board agreement that launched Whitaker Construction. It was engraved with his favorite quote, "Do it right, or don't do it at all." He'd forgotten that at the end, but I hadn't. And now, through this trial, I was doing it right. Not just for me, but for every part of him she tried to erase. Block 7. The fall of Elizabeth Harlow. The court proceedings stretched for months, but the damage to Elizabeth's empire happened fast. Media dubbed it the Whitaker Will War. Headlines flipped overnight. Heir disinherited, but not defeated. Mistress or manipulator, inside the estate battle rocking Virginia's elite. Love, legacy, and lies, the fight over William Whitaker's fortune. Her charities dropped her. Developers canceled deals. And her attorney, he tried to withdraw from her case mid-trial, citing client misrepresentation. Meanwhile, forensic accountants unearthed more. Hidden accounts, offshore transactions, shell LLCs created to funnel profits from properties my father thought were being used for community development. She hadn't just seduced him, she had laundered his vision through her own ambition. And now, she was exposed. The judge declared the will invalid due to undue influence. A new probate process began, this time with me as the sole legitimate heir. Her power of attorney was revoked retroactively, and all funds tied to illegal development projects were placed under federal review. Elizabeth wasn't just disinherited, she was indicted. Wire fraud, estate manipulation, elder abuse. The woman who once stood on my family's porch in designer heels now sat behind a courtroom table, shackled as the consequences caught up. I didn't watch the sentencing. I didn't need to, because she didn't just lose the case. She lost the story she wrote about herself. And I got to rewrite mine. Block 8. What remains after the fire? The estate came back to me in pieces. The house, the company shares, the land my mother once turned into a garden sanctuary, now overgrown, but still mine. I didn't keep it all. Some of the land was donated, properly this time, to a trust my father had started before Elizabeth ever showed up. The business? I placed it in a foundation, led by the same people she tried to erase. Gerald, Carlos, even some former board members she ousted. We renamed it the Whitaker Restoration Fund. Because restoring wasn't just about money, it was about memory. I sold the house after one final walkthrough. The study, the safe, the fireplace. I kept the portrait of my mother, and the chair where my father used to sit and read the business section with a cup of too strong coffee. Because as much as he failed me near the end, he was still my father. And I had his real words. Not the forged ones, not the rewritten will, but the handwritten letter I now framed above my new desk. Do what you must. You're my daughter. The rest is just paper. That paper had almost erased me, but now it testified to my name. Because the truth? You can steal money, you can fake documents, you can rewrite wills, but you can't bury legacy, not when it remembers who it belongs to. Block 9. Inheriting the fight. It would have been easy to fade away, to take the money, the justice, the victory, and disappear. But I couldn't. Because the court case wasn't rare. It was normal. Women, daughters, wives, caregivers are erased from estates every day under the guise of intentions. And manipulative heirs like Elizabeth, they know how to write themselves in before the ink even dries. So I launched the Whitaker Trust Advocacy Initiative, a nonprofit that helps families challenge unethical wills, detect elder influence, and defend rightful inheritances. Our slogan? Legacy should be earned, not stolen. We helped a retired schoolteacher reclaim her childhood home from a caretaker who tricked her mother into signing it away. We advised 3 siblings on how to contest a trust that excluded them in favor of a neighbor with access to morphine. And every time we won, I felt a piece of my own story being repaid forward. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about prevention, about making sure no daughter sits in a lawyer's office again and hears, "I'm sorry, you're not listed." Not without a fight. And not without someone like me sitting beside her, holding the documents, the history, and the truth. Because when you inherit betrayal, you have 2 choices. Let it define you, or refine you. I chose the second. Block 10, my father's daughter. They say grief is a process. But for me, grief was an awakening. It tore everything down, then handed me the blueprints to build something better. I don't visit the grave often, but when I do, I bring 2 things. My mother's roses, and the signed court, ruling that restored my name. I place them both at the stone that reads, William Whitaker, beloved father, trusted leader, imperfect man, because that's the truth. He wasn't a villain. He was a man, human, flawed, manipulated near the end by someone who knew how to weaponize loyalty. But in the end, he left a trail, a letter, a safe, a whisper of doubt that said, find the truth. And I did. So when people ask me now, was it worth it? The legal battles, the media circus, the pain. I say this. I didn't fight for an inheritance. I fought to prove I existed. Because love isn't measured in money. It's measured in memory, in truth, in the proof that you mattered. And thanks to one letter, one safe, and one voice that wouldn't stay quiet, I do. Forever.